All right, we are going to get started. So we're glad to have you with us today. We are presenting on supporting students on a continuum within the multi-tiered system of support framework. And this is our fifth webinar. Some of you have been with us for all of them. Some have come to a couple of them, but we've sent the recordings of them all to you. So we will, just like prior webinars, we'll do a little bit of a review of learning, not much today, a little bit of a review, and then we'll get into the meat of our presentation.
Don't bite me. I know you don't want me to get up.
I'm just going to mute everybody here. All right, so welcome. Just a few logistics for you. Very happy to have you with us this afternoon. We know your time is valuable and you don't have a lot of extra time, so we are grateful that you're here with us. We are in a meeting format today, so you're going to see screens pop up throughout the next few minutes. We are not in the webinar format. We've kind of toggled between the two different formats. And so please do remain muted unless you have a question or thought. We're more than happy to have you unmute to give some feedback or ask a question. We can also use the chat feature as well.
Line 21.
We can just make sure that you're all.
Lauren, I think we lost your sound. Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. Maybe I muted myself too. So as always, we will send you a follow-up email within 24 hours with a link to our slides today and any handouts or resources that we have embedded in the folder. Please do participate, ask questions, and then if you would be so willing to just spend a couple of minutes or even really 1 minute filling out the feedback survey at the end, that would be greatly appreciated. So we are going to try a poll today because we are in the meeting format, just to capture who's here and your school district. So Tammy's going to start the poll, and if you wouldn't mind just taking a few seconds to just put your name in and your school, that would be great.
So I have launched the poll. I don't know. Hopefully people are seeing it. It says it's going, but who knows with technology.
If you don't see the poll, can you just put something in the chat?
Oh, I think people must see it. I'm getting, there looks like some answers. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Tammy's doing the host, so she's probably getting the information and I'm not. So that's perfect. Okay. We'll give you another few seconds to do that. Tammy, just let me know when we're good to go.
Okay. For those of you just coming on, if you just joined us, there's a poll right now. Hopefully you're able to see it. We would just love to know who we have with us today. We're a small group. So hopefully you see the poll. It's just your name and where you're from.
Brian. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
All right, Tammy, how's it looking?
Almost, it's looking good. It looks like about 81%. So for those of you that are still going, I'll leave the poll up, but I'm going to transition to the next slide for you, Lauren, so that you can keep going with our introduction here.
Thanks. Great. So Tammy and I work for a company called Demonstrated Success, and we are an educational consulting company primarily based off the Seacoast in New Hampshire. We work with schools all across New Hampshire and in Maine and Vermont, and we support schools with a variety of different topics and different areas for teachers and for leaders, data, PLCs, of course, MTSS, ELA and math curriculum instruction and assessment. We do a lot of coaching, strategic planning, culture work, social emotional learning, and then working with school leadership, again, on those strategic plans and coaching as well. So that's who we are. We are both coming out of the public school system. We've been out for a couple of years now. So Tammy will toggle to the next slide. We'll do a brief, intro and a second here, supporting students on a continuum. I'm getting ahead of myself. This is our last webinar, as I had mentioned at the beginning. I'm Lauren. I have a background in classroom Spanish. I was a classroom Spanish teacher, high school level, and then I was a school counselor at the high school level, and then was an administrator working with students in a K-8 school. And in that role, I supported teachers with student behavior, classroom management, and multi-tiered system of support. And Tammy, I'll let you just speak briefly.
Sure. My name's Tammy Hilton. This would be my 20th year in education in some way, shape, or form. Most of that was spent as a high school English teacher. I did teach 7th grade English language arts for a couple of years, but high school was really where my heart was in terms of a teacher. Got my graduate degree, became an instructional specialist for several years in a middle and high school, grades 5 to 12 setting, building leader, and then I came to DS, like Lauren said, just a couple of years ago, so I haven't been out that long, and I'm very excited to have you all here today. Thanks, Lauren.
Great. So for today's objectives, we will explore how to use tiered practices to support students on a continuum. So we'll take you through tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 supports and strategies, and we'll think about these strategies in the academic realm as well as the social and behavioral realms as well. Great. So a brief review of our learning. This is our word cloud for MTSS. We really do feel that MTSS is doable for all schools, and we feel that it is a framework that can be embedded that is really personalized to your school's needs and your existing conditions. So your staffing, your budgeting. So it is feasible. We don't have to purchase new programming. We don't necessarily have to purchase new people, although that may be part of your budget at some point, more interventionist. But Tammy and I really do feel that, you can have a really well-established framework with the supports and the people and the programming that you currently have in place. And it should be comprehensive, right, to support all of our students. We've talked a lot about whole child, and thinking about the academic needs as well as the social, emotional, and behavioral needs as well. And then, of course, that last word I haven't mentioned yet is adaptable. And it really does go hand in hand with this personalized, comprehensive framework that you can make work, as I had mentioned before, to fit your needs. And so in terms of what we've talked about in this series so far, we've talked about the 4 stages of implementing a multi-tiered system of support in your schools. We've talked about evidence-based practices. We've talked a lot about various components of a multi-tiered system of support. So that is not only what we're doing in terms of our curriculum and instruction, right? But it's bringing in professional development for our educators, it's bringing in our families, bringing in our community, bringing our students into the conversation. So there's a lot of, various pieces to establishing this framework that we've discussed throughout this series. Teaming, of course, we've talked about our tiered teams, tier 1 team. And then generally when we've talked about the tier 2, 3 team, it's been one team. Some larger districts may choose, or larger schools may choose to separate out and have a tier 2 team and a tier 3 team as separate entities. But for our work, we are tending to just combine the teams together. And then finally, we've talked a lot about data, and you can see this data cycle around our image for this framework. So always working through that process of collecting data, analyzing our data, implementing our supports, and then evaluating its effectiveness. And so that is part of that intention we have with implementing our multi-tiered system of support framework, is that use of data to drive our decisions and to drive our work, again, in all realms, in all ways to support that whole child, right? So we start with that foundational level, and that's that core instruction, which everybody receives. Some students will need more strategic support, and then a few students will need more intensive supports. And this is our process. Again, we're talking about how data is driving all of this work. we talked about tier 1 again for every student's every day, all day, right? And we're using formative and summative assessments to progress monitor our students. And we're considering multiple data points, right? So we're looking at a variety of data to determine how our students are doing. And so, are they responding to what we're doing? If so, we continue with just the tier 1. If they're not, we have to think about, do we continue with tier 1? Do we change things up? Do we need to, request assistance from a tier 2? And so we sort of move through that same process, tier 2 and tier 3. You'll see that we've put at the top box here, 6 to 18 weeks in a tier. You could have students spend a whole year in tier 2, right? Varying up the supports within tier 2. But 6 would really be a minimum because that's like a typical data cycle, right? And so we just put basically like half a year here, but you could extend your supports. And you really do work through the same process through each of these tiers. How are your students responding as you pull that data, you evaluate it again? And do you need more or do you need less? And so for that reason, we know that MTSS can be flexible, right? And it's fluid, and it really is, we can turn and we can pivot based on what our students need. Great. So we're going to get into the bulk of our work here today. So Tammy's going to start off talking about some academic tiered practices.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. Okay, so like Lauren was saying, supports are really layered in while students are still receiving tier 1. So tier 1 never goes away. Remember, tier 2 is in, or 3, is in addition to tier 1, not instead of, right? So kids, we try not to say like they're a tier 2 kid, they're a tier 3 kid. Rather, we want to just think about them as a student who is receiving tier 3 supports in, or a student who's receiving tier 2 supports in. Like Lauren was saying, students can be at different tiers in the areas of academics, behavior, and SEL simultaneously, if that's what they need, or they could be receiving support in just one area. But those determinations are really based on the personalized needs of the child and that data that's driving it. So with that in mind, when we think about tier 1, again, we want it to be really good, relevant, engaging core instruction. And so this is a list. It is certainly not an exhaustive list by any means. This is just a list with, a few ideas that are out there, but we chose these because we feel like these strategies could also fit in with the the behavioral or the SEL supports that a child might need. So it's kind of thinking about that whole child. So with reciprocal teaching, that's where, kids are working together, they're taking on some leadership and they have some autonomy. It works really great in all content areas, as well as with word problems in math. And they are collaborating with each other and building those speaking and listening skills. Collaborative writing. This is great in pairs or small groups. It really provides time for collaboration. Again, it gives kids some choice. It gives them some tasks and some roles. It helps with organization in terms of executive functioning because it helps set deadlines. It builds creativity. In math class, this is also really great to do too. If you ask kids to write about their process or their reasoning behind things, it really gets them reflecting and thinking and builds those writing skills through math. Think alouds are really flexible and versatile for all grade levels and content areas. It really supports comprehension and comprehending material. It makes thinking visible. So you as the educator can really see or hear or view like what kids are thinking and where they're at in their process. So it really supports that demonstration and modeling. And by you doing this, by you modeling this, it's really showing kids how to think and what the process of thinking and learning and interacting with material really means. I think it's, we tell kids this all the time, like, show your thinking, but we don't actually demonstrate how to do that for them. And so having think alouds in your class will help you do just that. Mind mapping or sketch noting. This is really just a fancy name for visual note taking. So this is going to help kids not only with their note-taking skills, regardless, again, of grade level or content area, but it's also going to help them start organizing their thinking, showing relationships and making connections between thoughts. It's going to help them with their non-linguistic representation of things. It's going to strengthen their memory. It also, research has shown, if we're thinking about it beyond academics and with that connection to SEL, research shows that this activity also enhances focus, it reduces stress, and it's highly engaging. And for a lot of students with anxiety, it can be really helpful and supportive. Silent conversations listed here are supports in writing, thinking, and discussion. So what this does, again, it has the SEL benefits because it's going to slow down the processing speed and really enhance that complex thinking. And for you as the educator, it's great formative feedback. We talked about data a couple of minutes ago. This really creates a visual record of thoughts for kids, and it's really great for building their confidence and is highly engaging, as well as working on those writing strategies. Journaling falls along the same lines. It provides this safe space for kids to work along with enhancing their memory, their goal setting. Goal setting is really important for kids to do. It's great that we do it for them as educators, but kids really need to, set their own goals to understand their learning throughout this process. And then there's multiple ways that teachers can use journals. It can be free writing, it can be double entry journals, it can be teacher selected prompts, it could just be for brainstorming, note taking, even math practice or vocabulary. The jigsaw method is another great cooperative learning strategy that, again, supports not just academics, but SEL and behavior components for students. It enables each student to have sort of a home base or a home group around a topic that they can really work to improve their speaking, their listening, their comprehension, and cooperative learning strategies. And then rotational blended learning is this is when we did this a lot, whether we realized it or not, I think when we were doing like the hybrid model, but you could do this either online or in person. It's going to allow kids to work both individually and collaboratively. And it's a great way to differentiate within a process. And so these are all blue because when you get a copy of the slide deck tomorrow, as Lauren mentioned, in an email, you'll be able to click on these blue hyperlinked strategies and get further information about them. So then, again, tier 1 never goes away. So all of those things could be used in tier 2 supports as well, because we're just layering in or we're layering on the supports. We're not necessarily taking away or changing. We could, but we don't have to, right? So when we get up to tier 2, we're thinking about small group work, typically 3 to 5 students, because whatever strategy you're using, it's going to be targeted to them. It could be done with the classroom teacher, or it could be done with an interventionist or specialist. Again, not all schools have them, and that's okay. Lauren and I are, again, like she said, not promoting the fact that you need one. This is just a place where they might come in for those extra supports. And then you are going to do some explicit scaffolding, that feedback and goal setting we were just talking about. Feedback is really important. It has to be meaningful and responsive. We don't want to just say to kids, oh, you got this wrong, why don't you go back and recheck it? Because that's not really going to be helpful for them, whether it's because they need enrichment or support. You really want them to think about or be explicit when you name what it is they're doing, whether it's a strength or an area of need, and then go from there with the kids. And when we think about this, you really want to aim to have at least 6 to 8 data points on a child throughout that data cycle Lauren mentioned within tier 2. And then you want to provide multiple opportunities for them to practice, right? So regardless if they are in tier 2 because they are struggling or because they need enrichment, they need multiple opportunities to practice, engage with, and interact with that material. And then you might pre-teach or reteach or just go beyond the content skills for those kids who need a little bit more. than what the general tier 1 instruction is giving them. Thinking about that question, what are we going to do with our kids that are meeting or exceeding the grade level standards? We can't just leave them and go work with the struggling learners all the time, right? So what can we do to support them? Not all schools have a gifted and talented program or specialist. And so you'll want to think about ways to find supports for those students in this as well. And then tier 3, remember, special ed should not be your tier 3. Special ed should be above your tier 3. Special ed students can be part of this MTSS process. And so when we talk about tier 3, it should be that layer of support before that special ed referral or request for outside assistance is made. But this, like Lauren said, it would just be a few students within your population. So this would be individualized instruction where kids are possibly getting one-to-one supports. The big difference, or a big difference between tier 2 and 3, is that the frequency and the intensity changes. So again, all of those things, a jigsaw, the small groups, all those things that we talked about could be done, but it's just going to be more intensely and more frequent. It could be specialized support. So working within an evidence-based program that really is tailored to their needs, where you're differentiating and making that work for them. Again, it's driven by data. You want to have multiple types of data: formative, summative, universal, homegrown. In tier 3, we typically tend to have written plans of action. So this could be some of that goal setting that we just talked about a couple of minutes ago. You want to make sure that you're sharing these written plans, not just with the student who should be involved in the creation of them, but also with all the rest of the stakeholders. So classroom teachers, paraprofessionals, specialists, interventionists, admin, possibly, depending on if we're talking about, academic, SEL, behavior, all of that. And then flexibility. RTI tends to be a little bit more rigid in terms of the way students can move through tiers. However, with MTSS, it's really driven by that data, with the idea that there's an element of flexibility so that kids can be in various tiers at the same time, or at different times if needed. And then we have an image here of just some suggestions of strategies in regards to academics. So it's kind of like an if-then. So if your student is struggling with comprehension, then try some of these strategies. And so we can see them here for comprehension, fluency, phonics and phonemic awareness, math, and writing. And so this will all be in the folder for you. You could certainly look some of these up. Some of you are probably very familiar with a lot of these, but just really thinking about, again, like, what are we going to do with these students, whether it's because they need support or enrichment. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about social emotional learning and behavior.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's move to this first slide here. So you are familiar with this castle wheel. We've shown it earlier in the series, so it probably looks familiar to most of you. This is from the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning. CASEL is the acronym for it. Just to review, it's an organization that's comprised of researchers and educators and child advocates who've been working in this field for 20 plus years. To really hone in on the most important social emotional skills that we want our students to acquire. And so they've landed on these 5 components: self-awareness and self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And within each of those areas are specific indicators, explicit skills, such as, for example, for self-awareness, identifying emotions, recognizing strengths, self-confidence, self-perception. So it's explicit. And that's the piece of that we'll talk about in a few minutes as we move through some of these practices, that explicit piece of instruction when it comes to social emotional learning. So I just want to bring your attention back to the wheel, just because when we're thinking about SEL, these are these really important areas that, I'm hoping you can come back to these areas, this image and information, as you sort of lay that foundation when you're thinking about your SEL curriculum or your behavior programming and the supports and strategies that you choose to put in place. So as we're moving into SEL and behavior, I personally have a hard time separating them out in a multi-tiered system of support, because these two areas are really interconnected and we really need to focus on them together. So, and this, right? So for example, if you have a student who's struggling with an unwanted behavior, such as teasing or unkind language toward a peer, you really want to hone in on a specific piece of this wheel here. So I really encourage teachers and educators to think about behavior and look at what the lagging skill is, or the unmet need. And so when we're thinking about behavior, we're thinking about SEL, we want to think about what is that unmet need or that lagging skill that we can develop within our explicit SEL instruction, right? So if we've got this student teasing unkind language, toward the peers, we might want to hone in on self-awareness, self-management, right? So we want to focus on an area, and that will help us better plan, how we want to support that student, right? So if we work with a student who's anxious, we want to develop and strengthen skills, again, of self-awareness and management. We want to learn new strategies like replacement behaviors to employ, right, when the student notices these feelings are coming on. And it's hard to make a plan for students unless we can isolate specific skill areas within these really important topics. So for tier 1, I have broken them out, SEL and behavior, and then tier 2 and 3, we'll talk about them together. So these are some really high leverage ideas for tier 1, social emotional tier 1. And the first one would be social emotional curriculum for students. So embedding a formal SEL curriculum to explicitly teach social emotional skills is definitely one practice that you could implement if you're not already in your school to support social emotional wellness for students, right? There's a lot of programs out there. The Castle website that we have linked for you in the resources, if you've not been to this website before, it's very rich. There's very many layers of information in there, and there is a lot of information about SEL programming and different options you would have. In New Hampshire, a lot of schools use Choose Love. It's a free program, and it offers a family and community component as well. So it actually is used in several municipalities across our state. It's, again, a K-12 curriculum. It's explicit SEL instruction, and it develops the SEL skills, and it hones in areas of empathy, forgiveness, compassion, and courage. A second step is another very popular SEL curriculum. It's also K-12. It actually does have a pre-K option as well, and a family component, which is really great. A lot of these programs, as you're doing your research on what might be a good fit for your school, do offer a family component. So thinking about the components of MTSS, I would really encourage you to hone in on something that will also bring your families in, right, and your communities even better. This is not a free resource, right? So you do have to pay for this. So you would have to have some budgeting available for second step, as well as another couple would be a Leader in Me. If you're using that, that's another evidence-based comprehensive model that really works on building leadership skills and life skills within students. And it is a K-12 program, and it focuses on 7 healthy habits of effective people. So it talks about productivity and goal setting and personal wellness and healthy relationships. Those are just a few, but again, within that, that's how this program has separated it, but it comes back to those really specific and explicit skills that students need to have, like self-awareness and self-management. Responsive Classroom is another wonderful evidence-based program, evidence-based approach. So it's not a curriculum per se, it's an approach to teaching, and it focuses on building student community and collaboration, promotes self-management and critical thinking with our students. We are going to talk about a couple of different high leverage practices from Responsive Classroom that I've included here in tier 1. I'm not necessarily promoting it, but I'm trained in it, and I have used in several settings. I have used a lot of these practices, and when we talk about them, you'll say, oh yes, these make sense, right? So we'll talk about that in just a second, but I will highlight some that I really do think would be great for all of our students in all of our schools. The second piece here is SEL for adults. So, taking care of your adults is just as important as taking care of our students, right? We put a lot of demands on our people, and we're asking them to potentially teach the social emotional curriculum to our students. And if they don't have a great grasp of SEL themselves, then that's harder for them to do, right? The effectiveness may not be as great for some teachers who may not be in touch with their social emotional quotient, right? So we want to make sure we're creating authentic opportunities for our staff to strengthen relationships, camaraderie, opportunities for them to reflect on their own self-care and opportunities to re-energize, and building our staff up just as much as we want to build our students up. So some schools who are really implementing SEL for their staff too are thinking about ways they can use their funds to bring in wellness for staff on a weekly basis, maybe a yoga after school or a walking group. Last school I was in, we had a walking group, cost nothing, was just a little bit of time, but it was a group of teachers, walking the grounds, getting some fresh air. There was a morning group, afternoon group, so that was something that was really, really nice that didn't cost anybody anything, and the benefits were huge. Coffee hours, right? Maybe when teachers aren't encouraged to talk about school, just dump it at the door, have a cup of coffee, get ready for your day. And then a buddy educator system. So setting up, buddies within your staff, your professional and or your, paraprofessional staff, to check on one another, to email one another, check in, drop a little something at the door, leave something in the mailbox, just something, to build relationship and let your people know that there are folks that are thinking about them, that care about them, and that they really do belong within your community. And then finally, SEL integrated into academic instruction. And this comes up all the time, right? It feels like, sometimes you're being asked to make choices between SEL and then growing the academic skills that your students need, right? To make grade level and to progress. And, I think it's all in how we look at this. I don't think you have to prioritize one or the other. The skills that students need to learn really are the very skills that SEL provides, right? And so reflecting and perseverance and motivation, managing stress, asking for help, receiving feedback, those are just a few examples of some social emotional skills that are linked into our Common Core standards, right? Our Common Core standards, if we really dig deep and review them, we'll see that these skills are implicitly embedded in the standards. So they're there, and the standard asks students to reflect, asks students, about feedback and perseverance, right? They address them, but we have to explicitly teach that. So it's implicitly embedded there, but we have to pull it out and explicitly teach it. So here's an example, Common Core example for math. Students make sense of problems and persevere in solving them, right? So a few corresponding SEL skills in the area of self-management, for example, that could connect here would be that working toward goals, stress management, asking for help, displaying, what is determination, efficacy, teaching that piece of that self-efficacy for students. So I have an article for you that's linked in here that gives you other examples of how you can read these standards and you can see what's implicitly embedded in there and help coach your teachers to explicitly pull it out. In terms of behavior, these are just a couple of ideas of tier one. This is not, again, exhaustive in any way, shape, or form, but these are a couple of ideas of some specific tier one behavior practices that of course, do embed some SEL obviously in here, but I'm going to just talk about them with the behavior lens for a second. I've brought in restorative practices throughout the tiers here for SEL and behavior. And so here are a couple of practices to think about that satisfy that tier one, for all students. So community meetings, this could be, or community circle, this could be already existing in the way of a morning meeting in your school. This could exist in an advisory at your school, but the idea would be to bring people in a type of a circle, right? And have a daily commitment to that circle where kids are getting to know one another, getting to appreciate their similarities, appreciate their differences. And the idea with restorative practice is that if we can take a tier one practice like a community meeting or a community circle, we can then strengthen that circle through the tiers. So we can strengthen a community circle to a repair circle if something happens that we need to address with our class. So we can take this tier one practice and we can, again, strengthen it as situations come up. But we can't ask our students to sit in a repair circle if we haven't taught them how to participate in a community circle first. So this is an example, again, of a tier one practice that can be embedded and or strengthened if you already have meetings going on in the mornings or after lunch or at the end of the day. A community agreement, those are statements that describe the environment in which we want to work. So agreements are co-created by students and teachers, and they're statements that have to do with taking care of ourselves in our learning community, taking care of others in our learning community, and taking care of our space, right? Our learning community in general, that space that we take up. They really do serve as a reference point for all interactions, and it helps to, these statements help to promote self-discipline because kids have been part of the process to create them, right? So they're not rules. They're not the rules that begin with no and don't. They're statements that encourage, again, as we said, care of self, others, and space. Restorative conversations I've put in here as a tier one practice. This is where educators guide students through like a reflection, a protocol of questions to try to work through a situation that's come up. Restorative conversations can help identify root causes of a behavior or an interaction that's come up between two people, and help students take accountability and responsibility for their role in the interaction. So we could think about, using this, if you're an administrator on the call, you could use this type of practice, of course, with your students in your office, but you can use it as a classroom teacher as well, or a specialist working with students. And the reason why I didn't put this under tier two is because part of this is the type of process and the type of language and this conversation that we want to have with our students that becomes part of our everyday work, right? It becomes part of our common language when something happens in a classroom setting. This is how we work through conflict, right? And it's again, common language, and that's really important. And that can sit at tier one so that everybody understands this is how we handle situations when they arise. We can strengthen this practice and we can use it again, at a tier two level, perhaps. But I think it's important to teach kids tier one, all students, the way to resolve conflict, right? And how to have dialogue. So that is why this is sitting in tier one. Teacher language is really important, right? That's another practice to focus on, our words and tone of voice and pacing even really do permeate every aspect of our teaching and learning during the day. So our language is really one of the most powerful tools we have, and it is completely within our control. And I know sometimes when we're in schools, we might not feel like we have a lot of control all the time, but we can always control our language. We always have power over that. So we can hone in on reinforcing language, and reinforcing language is when we use that, we want to see and to name what students are doing and highlight their skills and their effort, their attitude, their quality of what they're producing for us so that they keep doing it, right? We de-emphasize personal, right? We take ourselves out of it, and we reflect back what a student is doing. So an example could be, I like the way you added details to your writing. You could be really specific to emphasize what you want to see, to reinforce what you want to see. And you could say to a student, you added key details to your main point. That helps the audience understand and be persuaded, right? So you're being really specific, and giving feedback, and you're, reinforcing what you want the student to keep doing. Reminding language is also really important. And so it helps, keep our student behavior on track, right? It's a good reminder and check for us as educators, because, we want to make sure that students are satisfying our expectations, behavior expectations, academic expectations. And so we can use that reminding language to help them do that. So an example of reminding language, right? Instead of saying sit alone, or next time, sit next to someone who you won't be tempted to talk to, right? We could say to a student, try to think about what you can do to help yourself concentrate. So it's just, students know we've taught them, but when we need to remind them again explicitly what we want them to do. And this is just a way to really not be so darn wordy and just be really direct with our language and what we want them to do. And then the last one is redirecting language. So we want to focus our statements on what we want them to do versus what not to do, right? So instead of saying something like, Tammy, could you refocus on your math? We could just say, Tammy, focus on your math, right? We can make it really specific, really brief, and what we want Tammy to do, right? So class, stop wasting time. We could say, freeze, everyone return to your seat with your folder, then we'll start. So it's just a way, again, to redirect and to bring people back. And one, final thought about language, which I think is really important, although I've called it teacher language here, it really needs to be language used by all adults in your school building. So you're thinking about your teachers, you're thinking about your counselors, your specialists, your classroom assistants, your lunch monitors, your food service staff, your front office staff, your custodians, your bus drivers. It's because it's, again, common language, and this is how we make change, right? When we bring all of our people into training and understanding all of this about, how to work with our students, you're going to see change. And so it's just really important to make sure that everyone's part of this teacher language as we work with our kids. I guess the same could ring true for logical consequences or natural consequences, right? So natural consequences, logical consequences are outcomes that result from a child's action. And they make sense to what the offense was, right? They're not punishments, right, which focus on retribution for a wrongful act. Consequences are, again, behavior outcomes that are specifically planned by a teacher or an adult, which focus on teaching the student to do better or to do different next time, right? And we want to try to streamline consequences, again, to the offense, and not have, like take away recess for not doing a worksheet, right? Or, take away recess for coming to school late, right? So we want to be sure that we're logical about how we assign consequences. These consequences should be respectful, right? We're not blaming or shaming, right? We're being kind and firm, but we are holding the line, right? We're reasonable. So we want to make sure that we're taking in a child's point of view as well as the adults, right? And consequences should be helpful, right? Again, we're teaching, right? It's a teaching moment. We're not punishing, we're not blaming and shaming. So we want to make sure that these types of consequences are helpful. And so a couple of popular logical consequences that really can be used across all the spans are loss of privilege, right? So it's logical, right? When a student behavior doesn't meet the pre-established expectation, and the student may lose a privilege of either, like, for example, if a student's making mess with the paints and you've redirected the student, you've reminded the student, but they're still making a mess with the paint, you're not going to take away art class from a student, but you're probably going to change the medium in which they work, right? You may give them colored pencils, you may give them crayons. So you're going to take away the paint because they're not using it responsibly, but you're not taking away art. So that's an example of a privilege, right? Timeouts, logical, positive timeouts are a great consequence that can be used, again, across the spans. You're not going to tell a ninth grader that they're going to go take a timeout, but, my last school we had for our eighth grade, we had like a couple of teachers were using a place called Contemplation Island in their classroom. And it was a table off to the side. The kids were still in the room, but they had sort of a processing protocol for kids when they got there that they used. And that was effective for the older students, right? It wasn't a timeout, or take a break, but it was logical for their development, and it worked. And we called it something that was fun for them. Break it, fix it, right? Making a mess, or break it, fix it with relationship, right? And that comes back to that restorative piece that we talked about a little bit ago. So in terms of behavior, again, just a couple more things. We're modeling. Tammy talked a lot about modeling earlier. We can use modeling to support SEL and behavior as well as academics, right? So this is when we model for students, we show them exactly what we want them to do and how we want them to do it. And then we offer us a chance for kids to practice what we want them to do. And then we give them feedback on how they're doing, right? So an example could be if you wanted your students to bring their chairs to circle. You want to teach them how to do that. And so you are going to teach them how to hold their chair safely and walk calmly to circle. So you demonstrate it. Then you'd ask your students to give you feedback. Like, what did you notice that I did there? How did I hold my chair? How did I walk? So you're going to ask some prompting questions. They're going to give you feedback. And then you ask a couple of volunteers to try it, to show their peers. You get more feedback. And then everyone gets to try it and you can give them feedback. So that is that modeling and feedback that we can do to really address what we want to see. We want to see students following expectations in the classroom. And this is a great way to do that. Many schools, I was just on the line with a high school yesterday. Many schools use school-wide and classroom expectations. It's not just elementary schools using classroom expectations, not just middle. Our high schools are doing it too. These are school-wide expectations that lay out behavior that we want to see in all settings around our school. They help to create safe and positive learning, right? And often they're like 1 to 3 words per expectation, and they may spell out like an acronym perhaps, or they may spell out like the name of the school, right? And so it could be significant to your school. But these expectations are posted in classrooms, they're posted in hallways, restrooms, the cafeteria, so all common spaces, right? And again, it's how we want students to behave, right? To be safe and to make the learning environment positive and productive as well. So I don't know, one that I've seen a few times is PAWS, PAWS, so positive attitude, act responsibly, work towards success, show respect. ABCs, act responsibly, behave safely, communicate respectfully. So this is how students, will learn these expectations. And then the last one I put here is a regulation station. I kind of alluded to it in the last slide when I told you about the Contemplation Island and how the teachers had sort of a protocol that students would go through. But a lot of classrooms are including regulation stations, not just, take a break spaces, not just elementary classrooms. This is a strategy based off a conscious discipline. It's an emotional intelligence program consisting of strategies for to respond to behavior rather than to react to it. And so basically in this space in a classroom, students work through a step-by-step process to identify emotions, calm, and solve their problem to get back to learning. Okay. And so some of these opportunities you could have in your space, depending upon what it is, like a calming movement, a proprioceptive opportunity for students. So that's like heavy movement, that's resistance bands, some tactile input. So sometimes you might have like rice or sand or poppets, dare I say the poppets. We can use those productively. And sometimes we have a calming auditory or visual input. So we may have students listening to music. We lower the lights. Students may read here. They may listen to a story on tape. So different ways to kind of think about what our students need to keep them in the classroom, to get them back to learning. And then I'm going to just combine SEL and behavior here and just talk about a couple of things briefly. And we'll think about these in the tier 2 with the tier 2 lens, right? And so that is for not for all students, it's for some students, right? And so check in, check out is a school-based targeted intervention. Many of you may be doing this already. It provides daily support and monitoring for students who exhibit like lower level behavior problems across different settings. So it's, again, based on a daily check-in, check-out, so a morning and afternoon, and it provides students with feedback on their behavior. And the other piece of that is it also increases adult attention to the student. So it works on relationship between student and adult. And again, it gives specific and explicit feedback in a timely fashion to students, right? So this could be a school counselor involved here. It could be a classroom teacher. It could be behavior specialist, also an advisor. So any adult can really take part in this process for students. Zones of regulation. This is a cognitive behavioral approach used to support development of self-regulation. And it teaches students, again, how to self-regulate feelings, energy, and sensory needs, in order to meet the demands of a situation that they find themselves in. And so that could be the traditional classroom, it could be cafeteria setting, it could be in your unified arts setting, right? So being able to identify the different zones in which, you're feeling your body kind of work through, right? It's one of the programs that I actually feel could be used and have seen it used as a tier 1 as well. And people have sometimes used this in their classrooms as tier 1 because, again, this becomes common language. Oh, you're in the red zone, right? Or you're approaching the yellow zone, or what's going on. It becomes part of your language in your classroom. And if we teach it to all students, then all students are going to have these same skills. So I put an asterisk here because this could really flex between 1 and 2, right? The same thing goes for social stories, right? So sometimes we think about social stories for our identified students. And, when a student fails, we want to put this story into place when a student fails to grasp like a social norm, a routine, or an expectation. Like it could be walking down the hall. It could be using the bathrooms appropriately. I've written a couple of them about bus rides for students. So those are just a couple of examples. It helps teach, again, what we want students to be doing. And we want to replace the behavior that they're currently exhibiting, which is not following the expectation. And it's presented in a very simple story format with basic explicit language. We use visuals here to support the words that we have in our story. And it can be more personalized, right, to students' needs. Again, we could flex this to tier 1 because I've worked with teachers who have written social stories for their students about classroom expectations, and they've sent them home to parents. And so parents have a copy at home. They've done this for every child. Parents have a copy at home, and this teacher reads the copy at school. So it can be used, again, not just when we have a problem, but it can be used on the tier 1 level as well. Small groups, this is where we have our small groups, 3 to 5 students. We have our interventionists working here. This could be school counselors running a social skills group. It could be your behaviorist running a small group. This could be a speech pathologist in group, right? Occupational therapist working in a group. So think about the various interventionists that you have. It also could be your classroom teacher, right? Providing tier 2 support, perhaps in a win period. So the what I need period. If you have any type of intervention block embedded in your daily schedule, a win, what I need, or an intervention block, it's like a tier 1 practice because we have it across the board. Everyone has access to it, but it's going to provide different tiered intervention. Okay. So that's where the small group would take place. And then again, I've pulled back in restorative practice. Repair circle, which I touched upon earlier, was where there's been some harm that has been done with a couple of people that needs to be worked out. And generally there's a facilitator that comes into this process to help students and or staff work through different situations. So that's that repair circle. The restorative conversation comes back. I've already talked about that as a tier 1 practice, but I'm bringing it back as a tier 2 practice because we can use it in this tier as well. And then finally, this is this one-on-one tier 3, hopefully fewer than 5% of your population would need this intense support. This could be your school counselor. This could be your mental health provider here, your school social worker, for example. This may be when you refer out because you don't have a social worker or mental health provider, so you need a local outside mental health agency. This could be your LADAC, so your drug and alcohol counselor. This is also perhaps when we look at a functional behavior assessment, so an FBA, which provides more information about a student behavior and really helps us identify factors regarding behaviors that may not be so obvious and allows us to look at data trends and track patterns of behavior. So it will help to identify root causes and functions. It also helps us examine those antecedents. So an antecedent is like what's happening before the behavior, right? So it really helps us hone in there. So that's a really important support or intervention that you could use towards your intervention to put in place in tier 3 would be an FBA. Home visits are great. I have done some home visits. They're great, right? We can really see a lot. We can learn a lot about a student and a family just based on walking through their front door or even meeting them in their front yard and having a conversation, right? This can also, if you think about home visits, and again, it doesn't have to be tier 3, you might do them tier 1 for all students. I was recently speaking with kindergarten, a school for kindergarten, and they do home visits for all their kindergartners, incoming kindergartners. Their teachers go out, school counselor, administrators go out, and they do home visits for all their incoming students. This can really help break down potential barriers that, a student or his or her family may feel towards school, right? If a parent has had a bad experience at school, having somebody come to your home or again, come to your yard, chat outside, right, can really help break down that barrier and send that message of, we're in this together. We're going to do this together. And that's really a great message, right, to send. Obviously, we want to make sure we consider any EL factors that may come into place. Special education needs as necessary. So, before you go and do that, you want to make sure the family that you're headed out to visit. And then finally, you'll see restorative practices coming back into place in tier 3. These practices are about reintegrating a student after a removal or a kind of absence through a welcoming process, a reentry process. And so part of restorative practices, we want to repair and we want to reintegrate kids back to the learning environment. We can come back to a circle to do this. We can have a reentry circle to do this work. We bring students in, we bring caretakers in, parents, outside providers, it's everybody coming back. If you think about a student who may have broken a law, right? Or one of those really, really big no's at your school, you might consider some type of reentry circle to bring them back. So we're going to conclude. We're going to go for one more minute and we're going to wrap this thing right up. Right, Tammy?
We are. So like Lauren said, as you log off the webinar today, we would really appreciate it if you take that quick, very brief survey that pops up. We really do read all of them. We read through every comment, every rating, and it really helps us in our drive to give you all the best professional development possible. And then with that being said, we really want to thank you so much for joining us today. We know your time is precious. And so we like to thank you for that. And our contact information is here on the last slide. So feel free to reach out if you need us. And then you'll also notice when you get the slide deck tomorrow that there's additional resources embedded here at the end. Lauren referenced that, but we have academic, SEL, and behavior, 3 pages of them. So
awesome.
Thank you.